Dr. Westina Matthews is a professor for the Center for Christian Spirituality at the General Theological Seminary in New York City, where she teaches contemplative spiritual direction. Westina received her doctorate from the University of Chicago with postdoctoral fellowships at both Northwestern University and the University of Wisconsin at Madison. She sits on the board of the Shalem Institute for Spiritual Formation in Washington, D.C., and is the author of Dancing from the Inside Out, Grace-Filled Reflections on Growing Older. She's the editor of This Band of Sisterhood, Black Women Bishops on Race, Faith, and the Church, and has contributed to several forward movement anthologies. She was also a regular contributor to Sacred Journey, the Journal of Fellowship and Faith. As a spiritual director and retreat leader, Westina companions people along the journey of contemplative living through holy listening, and I have added links to her books in the show notes. Westina, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for inviting me.
I appreciate it. Now, I guess I just wanted to start with the idea of teaching about the contemplative life. And, we were, before this interview, just kind of chuckling or, getting to know each other a little bit. And I was commenting on how it is so, there's a paradox in teaching something that is really so experiential. What you have touched and felt in your contemplative practice, you can talk about, but you can't really tell them what it is. And so I'm wondering how you guide people through the process of something that's so experiential.
Yes, I think that's exactly right, because we are so in our heads. We are so intellectual. And getting people to listen with the ear of the heart, to go down and understand that it's a journey inward, not an outward journey. And I also think that when people hear contemplative, they think it means sitting in silence for 20 minutes with a centering prayer, or it means sitting on a yoga mat in some awkward position and it hurts, and that this is supposed to be contemplative. And yet, I use the contemplative practices tree, which lets people know that it can be stillness, which is, yes, that meditation and centering. It can be generative, a loving kindness meditation, a contemplative reading, visualization. It can be creative, music, art, singing, journaling, which I love to do. It's active, it's pilgrimages, it's vigils, it's marches, if it's contemplative. And it's relational, storytelling, or it could be movement, dancing, walking, Tai Chi. And then there's the ritual, the retreats, the ceremonies. And when you present that to people, they begin to understand that contemplative is more about the inward journey. I said the doors open in, not out. And find the way when you lose yourself. Isn't that what Joseph Campbell said, of something about when you can find where do you find yourself over and over again? Where do you go to find yourself? Where do you find that peace? Where do you empty out? You got to empty out before you can let anything in. For me, I rode my bike yesterday for 10 miles. I live on an island. There's bike paths. I didn't know where I was. I was just emptying. I was just riding. And then on the way back, I had a talk with the Holy One. And I was listening and just pedaling. I was lost. That's contemplative. So teaching people to let go of their preconceived ideas of what it means to be a contemplative and to be open, I think is that's how I teach it, which is a little different, but it's the way that I experience contemplative. And so therefore I share that with others.
And so when you're guiding people this way, I'm sure the struggle for many, right, is, I mean, you're in a graduate school program, you're trying to succeed, and here's somebody saying, "Yeah, you've got you've got to let it all go." How do they, how do I do well or have a desire to do well in this class and also kind of release and let it go?
Well, one thing we've moved to, I've been teaching there for 10 years. We now
Mm.
do credit, no credit. So the
Mm.
grades are off the a little
Oh yeah,
like
good.
Jesus, right?
Right.
What, you don't grade us, Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
God, there's no grade, no grade.
Right.
It's your participation, it's being present. They have to write a paper, an academic paper, but there's no grade.
Mm-hmm.
So that if they show up and they participate, so that's one. Then teaching them to ask open-ended questions and not try to problem solve,
Mm-hmm.
which is very difficult. And also to be authentic and not be so concerned about impressing one another or impressing the professor, but
Mm-hmm.
to be vulnerable and to be authentic. And when you can ask those open-ended questions, I know, Ian, you studied at Shalem as well. And so
Mm-hmm.
learning how to ask those open-ended questions, there's no right or wrong. And when people have to stop and pause and then wait
Mm-hmm.
and then listen and hear what comes, you begin to do that kind of work. Howard Thurman, let me quote him, and I'm going to read it because I love that quote. Now, if I hear the sound of the genuine in me, and if you hear the sound of the genuine in you, if it is possible for me to go down in me and come up in you, so that when I look at myself through your eyes, having made that pilgrimage, I see in me what you see in me, and the wall that separates and divides will disappear, and we will become one because the sound of the genuine makes the same music,
Mm-hmm.
making the same music. When I can go down in me and I can come down in you, and then we are.
Mm.
And in a contemplative, isn't it about living in community, the beloved community, and love, and being at peace, and joy, and serenity? And that comes through stillness, which should not be confused with silence.
Mm.
Be still and know that I am. How do you get still within yourself?
Yeah, God, there's two different directions I want to go right now, but I want to follow up on that last thing you just said because, one of the when you gave that litany of things you could do as a contemplative early, one of the things you said was marches, and I was like, oh yeah, how do you march as a contemplative?
Mm-hmm.
And I sort of asked you that, but I guess sort of qualifying it is like, I'm guessing you're saying there's a stillness within you, even as you're marching for justice or the environment or something like that. Is that where you go with
There's a
that?
sense of rightness. And
Mm.
Barbara Holmes talks about crisis contemplation,
Mm.
that in a crisis, you can feel the contemplation. So, our witnessing that knee on the neck
Mm-hmm.
and the time that went, it was a crisis, but it was a contemplative moment for all of us that witnessed it at the time or after the fact,
Mm-hmm.
because you're like, where is God in
Mm-hmm.
this?
Mm-hmm.
And now what we're seeing happening in Ukraine,
Mm-hmm.
where is God in this? In the crisis can come that contemplation. Um,
Mm.
so that in justice work, think of Parker Palmer, and it can be the vigils with the candles that is just like this. There is justice, not just us. right?
Mm,
Richard Pryor used to say, justice is just us. We're
mm-hmm,
the ones that are going to go to jail. Justice is not
mm-hmm,
just us. It's the community coming together. When you are, that's your motivation and you're coming, that then becomes contemplative. Uh, Protesting, destroying in your anger, and I'm not sure that's contemplative. It would,
mm-hmm,
I guess they could say, I don't know if the devil made me do it or if
mm-hmm.
Jesus called me to do it, because even Jesus overturned the table in the temple,
Absolutely.
so there are those moments too.
Mm-hmm,
But it's only through prayer and contemplation that you'll know if you're being called to something. And perhaps you, Eon, I have a couple of times, it's been like an out of body experience. I'm like, why am I leading this demonstration?
mm,
And looking back in my past about something. Why am I speaking up about this injustice? Where does that come from? That comes through prayer and God, that
mm.
this is wrong. There has to be another way. And I stand here, on truth and right. That's contemplative. So it is, that's why you have to stay in prayer and meditation and contemplation to make sure it's not your ego that's speaking, right? Cynthia Bourgeault talks about that, the four ways of
Mm-hmm.
discerning. And the first is your mind, your ego. Your ego may say, this is what I should be doing. And then it may be your body, is
Mm,
your body. Uh, and then it is your soul, and then your heart.
mm.
And it's going through all of that. That's what you can get through discernment. That's what you can have through a contemplative. And always that question, where is God in this? What is God up to? And how should I think about this? So the powerful questions.
And I love that you sort of circled back around to what my other stream, which
Mm-hmm.
was contemplative as community. Because I think a lot of people, when you started out, you were talking about, oh, I don't want to sit on the yoga mat or any kind of mat or whatever. And I think for some people, the isolation of, well, really just being human, right? But also being a product of this culture that we're in right now that unconsciously or maybe consciously even trains us in alienation and separation from one another, right? Be it any myriad ways, right? So the idea that contemplative practice actually is a communal experience, I I, I sort of been very influenced by Audre Lorde, Carter Hayward, who are talking about God as mutuality.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me, when I started to move into that area, the contemplative work just took on a different nature. It wasn't about my own achievement or releasing my own anxieties as much as it was like coming into communion or using it as a path towards being with.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I
Well,
just, hmm?
it's the other, the other, and the work that I did around contemplative approach to spirituality and sexuality. So
Mm,
one of the questions is we were piloting these materials. Um, what we heard from the LBGQT community is, I may be welcome, but I don't feel like I belong.
yeah. Well,
And
let's
so
let's let's
belonging.
let's set that up a little bit because this is really interesting work that you've done, and you did it with Pastor Tommy. What's Tommy's last
Tommy
name?
Watkins, who
Tommy
was a
Walker.
student of mine, and Reverend Dr. Tommy
Oh,
Watkins.
yeah, he has a doctor now.
Yeah,
Yeah,
he's all of that. And
yeah,
he was the first openly gay ordained black priest in the in Alabama,
yeah. The Episcopal Diocese of Alabama. Yeah.
right, which is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And he has a doctorate in public health. He's a social worker, and he kept saying to me as a student, you should really do something around sexuality in contemplation. Like, this is not my issue. I'm not interested. And he didn't let go about it. And then when the Episcopal Church decided to voted to have same-sex marriages,
Mm-hmm.
and I started to see the splintering
Mm-hmm.
in the church.
Yeah.
And my father was an AME minister. That's
Mm-hmm.
how I was raised. And I don't think that my father would have married a same-sex couple.
Mm-hmm.
My sister said he would, so who knows, only he knows, he's up in heaven.
Right.
But I was like, I don't understand this, but there needs to be a conversation around it. And how could spirituality and contemplation be a way to have the conversation? And
Mm.
so he and I then began to work together, and I was able to receive 2 grants to do the work to develop a course, but also um, there's a there is a workbook which you can download free that you can get that you could use, plus a resource guide. And Tommy and I went around and did work together, even to El Salvador. We were
Mm.
invited. We went there to do some work. And in fact, there'll be something in Presence Journal in June, Spiritual Directors International, that
Oh,
we
great.
co-authored. Um, I've moved on to other things, but Tommy's still doing that work. But it's important work because it shows how you can take a contemplative approach and a spiritual approach to discuss a thorny issue. How do we get in the room together and have the conversation? And I've been in rooms with older white uh, Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I ask them, how did you first learn about sex? And they giggle and start to talk about how they first learned about sex.
Mm-hmm.
It's a common experience. How'd you first learn? How'd you first hear about it? Who told you? Uh, and then begin to have some honest, authentic, real conversations that we can hear one another in a safe and sacred space.
So what does that mean, to somebody who's listening to this when they're like, wait, contemplative approach to sexuality? Like, how does that happen as a conversation, you know?
It's script. We do use scripture.
Mm-hmm.
We also use Howard Thurman. We use
Mm-hmm.
Henry Nouwen. We use, some contemplatives,
Mm-hmm.
um, John O'Donohue, and we ask these open-ended questions. What's the difference between spirituality and sexuality?
Mm.
Um, there's an exercise about when you think of spirituality, take the 5 senses. What does it sound like? What does it feel like? What does it taste like? What does it sound? And then we say, how about sexuality?
Mm.
How does it feel? How does it sound? How does it taste? Uh, and it's an interesting way to engage people in a conversation of something that is taboo. But
Right.
in the end, where we take them is you have to be authentic. You have to be vulnerable and authentic and to be who you are, and reminding everyone, which I do wherever I am, not only who I am, but whose I am. And I always say God doesn't make junk,
Mm.
and God makes no mistakes. And so, and God forgives, right? You're forgiven. That doesn't mean there aren't any consequences. Don't anyone listening think there are no consequences for your actions. There are consequences,
Right.
but you are forgiven. And then there is then this sense of welcome home. We love you. We'll be together. We'll journey together. I may not always agree with you.
Mm-hmm.
I may not always agree with you, but I will love you because that's right. Love God, love one another, love yourself. That's it. That's the message, right? Love God, love
Mm-hmm.
love your neighbor, love
Mm-hmm.
yourself. So if you're doing that, then there is more spaciousness. I keep talking about space, grace and space. I need some grace to have more space in my life right now, particularly all that we've gone through in the last 2 years with the pandemic. This just has to be. And as you said, this partisan and this divide.
Mm.
Where's the space for grace? Where's the faith? I'm not perfect. You're not perfect. Where's the space for grace in all that we're doing?
Yeah, I think about sort of my own denomination, and I feel like with as the just going back to the divide in the nation, but also like where we see people reacting and choosing a position, right?
Mm.
The the practice of opening to grace just feels further and further away in so many places, you know. Um, and I guess part of me wonders, you know, you had a different life before you were a teacher of contemplative practice. You were
Mm.
in business world, and I don't know if there was something that you saw or felt, or maybe there was just a shift in you where you were like, yeah, I think that's not what I want to do with the rest of my life. I just want to train people to be contemplatives, or I don't know what happened.
I think there have been pivots in my life.
Mm-hmm.
I married my high school sweetheart 6 days after I graduated from college, and 11 years later, left that marriage with two suitcases, $50, and a draft of my doctoral dissertation,
Mm.
starting my life again. It was two good people, not in a good marriage. Um, and so then holding on to anything, realizing I was an adult child of an alcoholic and became very involved in Al-Anon, which I still am.
Mm.
And that just talks about a higher power, right? It said
Right.
it can be the Brooklyn Bridge, you know, whatever you believe.
Right.
There's a
Yeah.
power greater than yourself. So I did that. And then I became very ill with pericarditis, inflammation sac around my heart after I moved to New York and was working on Wall Street. And so it's life and death. They sent me home on Christmas Day to die. And I found unity. So then I went to Unity.
Unity
So I was
Church.
doing Al-Anon, and then I was going to Unity,
Yeah.
and Eric Butterworth up at Avery Fisher Hall. But I loved these positive affirmations. I was holding on to that. It was life and death. And then on 9/11, I was at the World Financial Center, which is right adjoining the World Trade Center, and ran down 33 flights and over the Brooklyn Bridge in 45 minutes. Jackie Joyner Kirschman's got nothing on me.
Yeah. Right.
But watching the buildings and the people dying, and I almost died. Um, that's what I said. Where is God in this? That took me to Presbyterian. I'm an equal opportunity.
Right.
So it's like, where, what in the world is going on? And it was that time I began writing. I journal, that's my contemplative practice, and it was finding its way in forward movement and in sacred journey. And then people started asking to meet with me, and I'm like, why? He said, well, we'd
Mm.
like to talk with you. Why? Well, we just want to spend time with you, which in spiritual direction, that's one of the clues if people say they want to spend time with you. But I decided then, well, if that's true, I needed to get training because,
Mm.
I am overeducated, doctorate,
Yeah.
a couple of postdocs. And the only program I could find that would work in my work schedule was Shalane
Mm-hmm.
because it's a distance learning and only twice a year. Each year, you have to go for 10 days.
Yeah.
But once I got there, I was home. I didn't know I was a contemplative,
Right.
and I was home. And around that time, I found the Episcopal church where I'm staying. But it was this journey of almost going back to Cynthia Bourgeois. I was in my head, and then I had to go to my body, and then I had to go to my soul, and then I had to go to my heart.
Mm.
And it was that journey and providing spiritual direction at General while I was working on Wall Street. And they asked me would I like to teach it. And I'm like, really? I don't have a degree in my background is in education. It's
Right.
not in religion and theology. He said, you have a terminal degree, you can do it. And what I realized, my life experience and my education, because I know pedagogy and how to teach.
Right.
And what I do is I offer people what I need and what I want. That's what I do in my workshops and my retreats and my teaching. This is how I can learn it. This is how I can be. And so it's attraction. People are like, yeah, I'm on that journey. What does Rumi say? What you're seeking is seeking you,
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, okay, I'm seeking. That's why I love the seeker's table.
Mm.
Is, it's what I'm seeking is seeking me. And I'm just looking for that path, knowing it's inward, knowing that I can share it with others and create a safe and sacred space. This is what I used to say, a safe container. The last 2 years, it's now safe and sacred.
Mm.
There has
Oh,
to
that's
be
such a
place.
great modification to that.
Mm-hmm. A safe and sacred place. And so whether you call it, love or mystery or source of all or spirit of life or God or she or divine one or Holy Spirit, or safe and sacred,
Right,
safe and sacred. Buddha, safe and sacred.
right,
Here's where you can be that's safe and sacred.
right. So we're gonna release this for Lent, and we
Mm.
we talked about the reading for the third Sunday, which is Isaiah 55, 1 through 9. And it's a longer passage, but there are a couple of lines that really stick out to you. And I'm wondering if you want to just sort of share why these are so important to you.
Thank you. Yep. You gave me choices, so I read
Yeah.
them all to say, well, which one? And as Isaiah, of course, in the Old Testament, for
Mm-hmm.
those who may or may not know, and he was the first to prophesy that
Mm.
Jesus was coming, the Messiah was coming. And I understand he's quoted the most times in the New Testament.
Oh.
I'm not a biblical scholar. I'm just sharing what I know
Mm-hmm.
from being in the pew with my father those years. But there were two verses particularly. Um, Verse 3, incline your ear and come to me. Listen so that you may live.
Mm-hmm.
Listen so that you may live.
Mm-hmm.
Holy listening. Listen so that you may live. And then verse 6, seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near.
Mm-hmm.
Those two spoke to me. Um, and it's what Tilden Edwards, who founded Shalane, would say, read the scripture and find a verse or a phrase or a word that shimmers. It
Mm.
just shimmers within you. And so it's like, incline your ear and come to me.
Mm.
Listen so that you may live.
Mm.
So much of our prayer life, we talk. We
Mm.
talk to God, our higher power, Brooklyn
Mm.
Bridge, whatever you
Mm-hmm.
want to call it.
Right.
We do the talking. But do we listen? It's the
Right.
listening to be still and know that I am listening. Uh, that's it. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. And he's as near as we allow ourselves to be open to. So and you probably learned this too in spiritual direction. I always listen to see who someone's praying to. Is it God the Father, God the Son, or God the Holy Ghost? Are they praying to God? Are they praying to Jesus? Are they praying to the Holy Spirit?
Mm-hmm.
And then that I meet them where they are.
Mm.
Is it the divine one? Is it she? Who? What? Is it dear one? Who are they praying to? I meet them there. Uh, and so I think that part of being a contemplative is that openness to knowing. My father, when I went off to the University of Dayton, where I did my undergraduate, Catholic institution, I'm Methodist. My parents said I had to go within 30 miles of home. Wherever you go, just has to be 30 miles from where you live because we got to take you in a car. So my first day on campus, these people asked me, what am I? And I said, am I? What? They said, what's your faith? Are you Catholic? I said, no, I'm Methodist. They said, oh, you don't drink, smoke, or dance. And I'm thinking, let me go home and tell my parents because I don't think they know this. And so I was commuting and I went home and I talked to my father. I said, what's this about Methodist versus a Protestant and Catholic? And here's what my father said, which has been life-giving to me. He said, well, the way I look at it, all over the world for centuries, people have believed in something greater than themselves.
Mm-hmm.
To me, he said, that means there is a God.
Mm.
And he gave me the freedom then not to bind myself to a denomination or rules or laws, but rather it's the divine, you
Mm-hmm.
know, however you choose to worship in something greater than yourself is what calls to me. Did I answer your question or am I just talking? I mean, sometimes I talk and I don't even know what your question was. So,
Well, I actually no, I like that also because I mean there's that sort of great Dick Gregory quote who's like there is no Catholic sun, no Baptist moon, right? And or I'm hoping it might be that it might be a slight paraphrase,
so
but essentially it says
I was like, yeah, I'm agreeing whether he said it or not is a
yeah.
good quote.
No, he says I think that's what he said, but it might be a slight paraphrase. Anyways, I think when you read that line, right, verse 3 from Isaiah 55 is incline your ear and come to me, listen so that you may live. And while I have an ordination in a particular denomination, I think if you're putting the loyalty of the denomination before the listening, then you
Mm-hmm.
probably aren't listening. Which doesn't mean I don't still work for the denomination or whatever, right? Um, or I don't find a certain resonance with it. But my listening is not for what the denomination says, but for what God is saying.
Yeah, the book that I did, the most recent book, uh, this band of sisterhood
Mm-hmm.
with first 5 Black women diocesan bishops in the Episcopal Church. I start the book and saying, I'm not that kind of Episcopalian. I don't know all the rules and the laws and
Right.
mechanical. I don't know that.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but I'm still drawn to Episcopalians. That speaks to me. Maybe it's the ritual.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate that. Uh, and with all the confusion that goes on in the world, when I was working on Wall Street, um, I liked knowing what was going to happen in the service. Now we're going to stand. Now we're going to kneel. Now this is going to happen. Now that. Thank you.
It
Thank
all
you.
ends with the Eucharist, with the
All
Episcopalians.
righty now.
Yeah.
and I can confess my sins and I'll be forgiven. I'm right here. I'm
Mm-hmm.
feeling you. And so that, I laugh about, but I'm very serious about my faith walk, but that speaks to me, but I don't know all the laws or the rules or and as you said, if I'm not listening, I'm listening to the word. I want to hear what others have to share. I drink deeply from your wisdom and others' wisdoms and experiences. I lean in for the
Mm-hmm.
homilies. It's like, okay, so what am I going to hear? And I've never been to a bad church service. Either it's on the way to church, it's in walking in, it's inside, it's afterwards, it's at the coffee hour. I've never been to a bad church service, which means you have to take yourself
Mm.
for the experience. It
Mm.
isn't that you're just going to receive, it's like you have to be part of it.
I was listening to an interview with you and Bishop Phoebe Rowe, and she had this line, right, that I think was dealing particularly with being a Black woman
Mhm.
who had been who had become a bishop, right? But she was talking about how to live in the world of no
Mm.
and still say yes. And you two had this really brilliant exchange. And the world of I mean, the world is saying no on so many levels, right? LGBTQ community, uh, people of color living in a nation that's so focused on white supremacy or wedded to it, really. Um, Women, all sorts of. Um, I mean, we could go down a huge list. So how does the contemplative life teach you, and maybe do you teach others who are facing this world of no
Mm.
all the time to still listen and say yes? Just as a, in a
Yeah,
big
I,
way.
I was thinking of Howard Thurman, how
Mm.
good it is to center down,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the contemplative. You've got to center down. If you allow external circumstances to define you, to narrow you, but how good it is to center down. I just got a note from Ambassador Andrew Young. He just turned
Mm.
90 years old, and he sent me a note. But what struck me about it, I've known him for years. He's a dear, dear mentor. He said, "You have survived," but he started with segregation.
Mm.
Then he said Wall Street,
Mm-hmm.
and I was like, wow, he's right. I'm old enough that it was segregated. I
Mm-hmm.
desegregated. My parents sent me to kindergarten. My sister and I desegregated the school. It was
Mm.
right after Brown versus Board of Education. He's right. I survived segregation.
Mm.
Um, so living in that no, uh, but saying yes to God. If I didn't believe, if I didn't have a faith, I don't think I could survive.
Mm.
And and now with all that's going on in the world, there's an old song. I ain't gonna study war no more, no more. I
Yeah.
ain't gonna study war no more. Remember that?
Yeah.
Without Nat King Cole singing it, it's like,
Right.
whoa, I'm going way back. It's like, I just, I have to look up,
Mm-hmm.
not look, not look out. Um,
It's funny when I preach on that hymn
mm,
sometimes, because it's a great teaching hymn. Um, and part of it, of course, it can be very literal, right? I'm not going to study war. I ain't going to study war no more. Which here we are with Ukraine, but also Palestine, like all sorts of places we are engaging in war. But also, like, I'm not going to study war no more with the war that I create in my own mind with my brethren. Because
yes.
boy, the war that I study the most is the people that I'm constantly trying to find wrong, or and I'm a great student of that of that kind of war, you
Yep.
know? And it's the contemplative practice that helps me see what I'm doing.
What did Mother Teresa said? I'm too busy fighting the Hitler within
Yeah.
to worry
Oh my
about the Hitler
gosh.
without.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
That's what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I'm battling. Um, I know we're closing up on our time. I want
Mm-hmm.
to talk about my Lenten practice right now because it's relevant. It's the spirituality of waiting. I make no major decisions during Lent.
Mm.
I started this about 20 years ago, uh, and it has allowed me to stay on very good jobs and in relationships with friends and family members. But I make no major decisions during Lent
Mm.
as a contemplative practice.
Mm.
And I spend that time in prayer and listening and journaling and living with the questions that are not answered. And it's a different kind of a contemplative practice, but I sort of crawl on my knees to Ash Wednesday, like, could we get to the beginning so that I won't force myself to make decisions I will regret later.
Right.
Let me just, and that's that the world is saying no. I need to say yes, but I need to say yes based on what is going when I'm inside, deep inside. What's that? Rilke, be patient toward all that is unresolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves, right? And then he ends it, perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. So my contemplative practice is inspired by Rilke, like, I'm just going to live with these questions.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to make any decisions. I'm not going to make any judgments. I'm not going to take any actions. Um, I'm going to get up. I'm not crazy now.
Mm-hmm.
Life and death and all of that, but I go through discernment and during that time. That's a different kind of a contemplative practice that we don't think about, but
Mm-hmm.
it's the spirituality of waiting, which Henry Nouwen reminds us in You Are the Beloved. He talks about the spirituality of waiting is not simply waiting or waiting for God, it is also participating in God's own waiting for us. And in that way, coming to share in the deepest love, which is God's love. That's it.
Westina, thank you so much. This has been a really lovely conversation, helpful for
Thank
me.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.